welcome in, guys. So we're gonna talk about the topic of like having a clean heart. Like you ever heard like Psalms 51, create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit within me, right? I think a lot of us like appreciate that verse in the Psalms. But like we're kind of talking about like what does it take to have a clean heart, and obviously that takes atonement. So we're gonna get into that. We're gonna look at some of the Old Testament examples of atonement and a sacrificial system, but then also we're gonna look at how mostly how Paul explains it, and the writer of Hebrews explains atonement, because they're breaking it down to people like the Gentiles who were not really aware of it, but they were aware of like sacrificial systems for sure, but not the way that um, the Jews went about atonement, right? Um, but yeah. So in the Old Testament, you don't have to go too far into the book. Um, but pretty much all you gotta do is just see like altars that are dedicated to God, right? By you know righteous men and women, right? So like Adam, his children, Cain and Abel, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, etc. And then you'll see how they make certain offerings, right? So that could just be like a peace offering, or it could be a guilt offering or a sin offering, you know. But essentially, it some of the times when it's like a sin offering, depending on what they're building the altar for. Sometimes it was just a dedication, right? Which would have been a peace offering, right, or a dedication offering. Um, but essentially, some of them would be for the atonement. That kind of replicates what we see in Leviticus, right, or even Exodus when they're getting the instructions for the tabernacle, right? Yeah. But atonement happens pretty much anytime you go to the temple, right, with the priest system, thanks to Leviticus. And of course, most no, not even most. Like all of it really points to Jesus, right, and what Jesus did in his sacrifice for making atonement for us, right. Um, Now Paul talks about atonement, right, um, and he often mentions it as like a process of justification, right. And so how like the order of salvation, um, you know, you believe in Christ, you're atoned by his work, right? And you believe that you're atoned by his work, and because of that belief, you're justified by faith, right? Through the atonement, right? Um, Pretty easy. He made it pretty easy to understand, right? But also, like, atonement's not like a word that is like specifically in the Bible, right? Um, Most of the time, I think like atonement's like a Latin word. I would have to look it up, but it's definitely like a word that is used in English, and we use it in our English Bibles, but never once has anyone actually used the word like atonement in any version of their language, right? Like transliterally, so like in Hebrew or Greek, or Aramaic. But we do see the words like redemption, propitiation, reconciliation, um, sacrifice that, created the new covenant, and Jesus' victory over sin, right? And that's how they're talking about atonement in the New Testament, right? Um, so, as we know from the last few videos, um, you know, sin is the biggest problem, right? Because mankind is spiritually dead, right? Um, our spirit man, what we get from the breath of life, the nefesh, died. And so we were cut off, and we had no way to reconnect relationally to God, right? And of course, atonement is a way for us to be resolved and reconciled back into that relationship, and back into the covenant that God made for us. Um, Now, in the Old Testament, there is like like four ways that you can have atonement. The word for atonement is kippur. Remember I said that atonement's not really used, but kippur is the more modern way of saying it. But there's also kapar, whatever. I don't really care how you say it. Because just remember, Hebrew is just consonants. So it's just KPR. you know, say it will. Anyways, pretty much, the ways that you can have atonement is what we know, right? As like an unblemished, clean animal, has to be killed. There's also the atonement tax, which is by money, which we'll look at. There's also you can atone things with incense, so that's just like consecrating things. But also, incense was used in the tabernacle to remind everyone of like God's presence, like the glory cloud. And that's supposed to be that also because it's a reminder that like they stank, right? Because of like the awful smells of sin, but also just because like at that time period, like people just stink in general. Imagine being in the desert for who knows how long and not having a lot of water. I mean, they were complaining, so like they might have had some legitimate problems, even though Moses would have said otherwise. He thought at some point they were being a little unreasonable. But yeah, that was just another way for them to be humble, but also to remember like God was there. That's why the incense was like right before the veil of the Holy of Holies. And then on the Day of Atonement on Yom Kippur, you get the scapegoats. So you get the two goats that are casted by lots, and one gets killed, and the other one, the high priest will put his hands on the atonement of the people and like transfer it into the goat, and then just send it far away from camp, right? Which is what God does. I'm trying to remember what Psalms it is. I want to say 130 or 132, but like far as east is from the west, that's how far He carries our sin from us. Like that's the concept that the psalmist was kind of going for. It was like, you know, God sends that bad boy way across away from His presence because He has nothing to do with sin. He don't want it, which we'll talk about. Actually, we'll talk about it right now. This is a little image. So like the atonement of blood is pretty much like a dialysis cleanser, for my medical people. But if you don't know medicine stuff, that's okay. This is pretty much like the illustration that I'm going for, right? So there's like one machine, right? And you get like, the blood's going out, the waste is going through, gets pumped back through here, and then gets cleaned and gets returned back, right? Same concept with atonement and why, there's like a lot of blood used. But yeah, like back to the, Day of Atonement, that's the big one, right? So you get like these little tiny resets throughout the Sabbath or how often you visit the temple, mostly on the three major feast days if you were like a Jewish male, because that was required. Jesus did it. Jesus did all the required stuff. But yeah, so pretty much you had the mercy seat, which God's presence was sitting like right here. I'll draw it for you. But like right here is where God sits, right? And the angels are sitting here, just to shield God's holiness. Anyways, like I was saying, so the angels, the cherubim, they're always there to just represent God's glory. God's presence is there, and of course, God sits on top of. So like this part here is the mercy seat, and this stuff below is the ark. Just for clarification. But yeah, so like the Ten Commandments, the tablets of the covenant, Aaron's rod and stuff are all gonna be inside this little bad boy. And of course it's transportable with this. And yeah, so but God sits on top, and this is like right next to like say the veil, which would be like back that way, right? Um, and that's where the people went. So and this would be like right before like the altar, right? And so he would sprinkle it with like the blood of like a bull and the chosen I put lamb, but this is supposed to be like the goat, on the mercy seat. And that's in Leviticus. 1630. You sprinkle it on the mercy seat, and that's how atonement was done for like the full year, right? So that's like the whole reset for the year, and then you had like little small, little small um, in between times, of reset and atonement for like your individual self, right? And then like as a people, you would be atoned. And of course, like there was like other stuff that happened on the Day of Atonement. So like small scale, this is not a Day of Atonement, but this is just like a general atonement of like sin or guilt offering. Um, you get like you kill the animal, sprinkle the blood, and then you give the best fats were not to be eaten because that was for God, right? And then the priest would eat like the rest of the animal, right, for the Levites because like they didn't have the only inheritance they had was like the tabernacle and the temple, right? And then they would eat it, and then so they'd be consuming like essentially the things that was like the sin, right? It's like a consumption of the sin, which is supposed to represent like God like eating the sin. And which is why on the Day of Atonement they weren't allowed to eat like any portions of the sacrificed animals, and that was all left for God on the Day of Atonement because God was absolving the priest of the sins that he took on for the people, right? So like the meat that he would eat, the fats and all that, which is like the waste products, which we know in modern medicine like holds like, um, you know, like the fats and like the main organs, like the liver, like those are all the things that like carry like the waste. Like they would eat that, and then they would put on that sin on themselves. And then on Day of Atonement, they were atoning for themselves and also for the people because they represented the people because they had been eating like, symbolically and, literally like the food of the sacrifices. Which is why when you look at Hebrews, when they talk about Jesus being our high priest who took on and bore our sins for us, like they're talking about that whole system that's happening where like they're eating, like the sacrifices and stuff. Except like the writer in Hebrew points out that like it wasn't even like a blood of an animal; it was Jesus's blood himself, right? And then God like consumed all that sin, which is why Jesus like bore the wrath of God. Um, and that's like in Hebrews 9 through chapters 9 and 10, right? Um, and then again, it's like a dialysis concept. Like you're just, um, you know, cleansing all the waste and then putting purity back into it, right? So then you're functioning again, right? Now the interesting thing about atonement, right, is that like the New Testament and the Old Testament don't really explain like the how, like the process of atonement, just only like the why, right? So we know for sure that like we need atonement because of sin, right? And then we also know that the solution of atonement is given via Jesus' sacrifice at the cross, in the New Testament. And then Paul, like I said, discusses atonement as a process of justification, and he explains this via the concepts of like redemption and like propitiation and reconciliation, right? And then Peter and others, I want to say James, definitely the writers of Hebrew, kind of mention atonement as like a victory, like a sacrifice that was created, for the new covenant, right? That was replacing the old covenant, right? Um, and of course, we were, it only replaced the law, right? Um, because the old covenant is still like the Abrahamic covenant, right? It just kind of replaces the it doesn't even replace the Mosaic covenant that God made with the people of Israel. It just gets rid of the law. So we don't depend on the law for salvation, right? As Paul says, but we have salvation through justification through belief in Jesus, right? Any person that says that Jesus is Lord is saved, right? Easy. That's in Romans, right? And then So yeah, so that's kind of like the sacrifice was created via the new covenant, and of course we know the new covenant. Jesus kind of alludes that with like communion when he like has like his the bread that was broken is representing his body, and then like the wine is supposed to be like his blood, right? And I mean, Jesus went all out. We all know he talked cryptically, which is very, like it's just kind of funny how like Jesus like always talked kind of like in code or cryptically or just like I don't know, like I like to call him like the Riddler. He just talked in stories. But it's kind of like how the Jews read like the Old Testament, right? It was just like a bunch of um like elusive illustrations that had a main picture and had like a main thing, but they didn't really know what it was, right? So they had to put all these pictures together to see who the Messiah was. There's not like one specific like vision or prophecy that's just like, okay, he's gonna be born here, he's gonna be doing this, and he's gonna die and resurrect, right? Like that's why like everybody was kind of confused, right? And that's why Paul talks about this with like the lifting of the veil, right? And how some Jews still have that veil, right? And some Gentiles too, right? But we don't have that because we have freedom in Christ, right? So we have that liberty. The veil is lifted, and so we're able to see these connections, with Jesus and see how it's tied into these other messages, that were written in the Old Testament, right? Which is why I'm such an advocate for like reading the Old Testament because you're probably missing stuff, especially if you keep trying to read like the letters of Paul. Um, People forget that Paul was a Pharisee, and so like literally he's just making like a lot of riffs and like mentionings and references to the Old Testament, right? And of course, like I'm a footnote person, so like anytime I see like a reference, I like to go back and read like what the actual source was, and then go back and then read the thing and be like, okay, this makes more sense in the context that he's talking about, right? And of course, he's adding on this layer, trying to bridge the Gentiles, right, and address their concerns. But anyways, um, yeah, so, you know, like I said, like we don't really explain like the how the process, we just know the why. But to explain the how, you have to look at like the stuff that's in the Old Testament. Like I mentioned, like there's the altars that were made in Genesis, with Adam, Noah, Abraham, like like a lot of the times when like they make these altars, we often well, I want to say confused. It's just we add another application. Um so there's like only one interpretation, but there's a lot of applications that you can have while reading the Bible. But like say like the names of God, or like a lot of the names that we associate with like God is actually like a name of an altar. Like say like Jehovah Nisi, that's actually like a name of an altar, but they named it that, like the altar, that name was because God was their banner. During the battle of, I want to say I could be wrong, y'all. It's been a minute since I read that one. But you get my gist. But yeah, but we see this, with like the altars and so we, there's like a sacrificial system. And like I said, I know church tradition says that like God was the first one to like establish this as during the garden, but we don't really know, right? It's not like specifically stated word for word. Um and that's okay. That's why we have church tradition, right? Um but yeah, so um what can we pull from these like, altars that were being built? I mean, for one, we definitely know that sin is our biggest problem, right? Like I mentioned, like man died spiritually. And of course we kind of see that if you look at Genesis like 2:7 and like Leviticus 17:11, 13 through 14, right? It kind of talks about like this like the breath of life, like the living spirit that we have, right? And of course, all we know is that, something that we have makes us different. And, it's because we bear the image of God, right? And so, like, we bear the name of God. And so that's like when you see in the Ten Commandments, like, thou shalt not, bear, the name of God in vain. um, it's because it's like a role that we have, right? It's not like a singular attribute that makes us like special. It's the role that we have that makes us special, like the function that we have that makes us special. So yeah, both animals and man have nefesh, which we see in Genesis 1, 20 to 21. But man has, was corrupted with sin, right? So animals did not have sin, right? But they do suffer from the effect of sin, which is why Paul, it says in like Romans, 8:19 kind of summarizes that, you know, and that's why creatures and animals are all suffering from decay and death, but not from sin, right? Which is why, the blood of animals is used for sacrifices, right? So that kind of explains the why of why we use, or we used to use animals, and why blood is so important, right? Because blood is the thing, and that's kind of, I don't know, since like humans inherited the sin as like, I don't know if it's like a genetic trait, but we definitely inherited sin from Adam, right? I don't know how that works specifically. We can all speculate. But and it's transferred via bloodlines, which is why like God so like when you read the Bible, you start noticing like the track of genealogy, which is why Jesus' genealogy is very important, right? When you look at Mary, and then I think Luke tracks Mary's genealogy, and then Matthew tracks Joseph's genealogy, which is interesting, right? I'm not gonna talk about that, but it's interesting. Go study it. It's inherited, like we inherited sin from Adam. So Jesus being the second Adam, he uh you know he came in and like was like the perfect example, right? So he came in to be like the perfect Adam, and also like just the perfect Israelite. Like pretty much anytime somebody failed, he came in and like made sure that he. So there's this concept in like the we'll talk about these people in church history section later on. But Irenaeus and Athanasius, they kind of introduced this theological idea that's called recapitulation, right? So that's pretty much just saying that like Jesus kind of like recapitulated the life of Adam, Israel, people for all time, so bringing humanity into the fullness before God, right? Which is why he's like the perfect example. So he lived the perfect life for everybody who messed up, did something wrong, didn't exactly keep covenant with God. Um, and like, so when Jesus, kind of like, died as a substitute for humanity, he did this by one, like, you know, while being divine, also being in limited nature as human, right? By the emptying himself, right? The humbling of himself. Um, he he became that substitute. You know, and like he could have been he's the only one who could have done that, right? Because he still had like the divinity of being with the Father, right? Um, which is which is incredible when you think about it. Um, but yeah, so like Jesus was like the perfect one, right? Which is why when you look at which one is it? Okay, yeah. So Hebrews 10:12 says like, but he was our high priest, offered himself to God as a single sacrifice for sins, good for all time, because we were trying to figure out like why it's like good for all times, because Jesus offered himself, right? And he's like that perfect example. I think like Paul says like like emulated mankind, like he became mankind, which is just talking about like Jesus's incarnation. But yeah, and then that's why he sat down in the place of honor of God's right hand, right? So like he conquered death, resurrected, ascended, and is back on the throne of God, right? And of course, like God had to like build up this like anticipation almost, and like it lay out the groundwork of understanding. Because as we know, God's ways are not our ways, but He does like to play the long game, which is why like His patience is like way better than ours for sure, right? But yeah, like we see like these little uh a lot of I guess a good way to say is like I'll just I'll just call it like there's a lot of symbolism in the Bible where like you see in the Old Testament how like it carries overs and like it kind of represents Jesus, right? So like like the lamb, like our Passover lamb, like Passover lamb, like the doorstep, the doorpost, sorry, the doorpost that was like covered in blood for like the angel of death to pass over, like all that kind of like has some type of shadow symbolism that kind of conceals like Jesus's work of like what was gonna happen in foretelling of the future, right? But Jesus did that as a fulfillment, right? Which is why a lot of these festivals that we have that got instituted kind of like ministers and points towards Jesus, right? And it's the same thing about like the sacrificial system. Um, yeah. So so we have this concept of like animal sacrifice, so we know why we sacrifice animals. And God doesn't just enjoy killing animals because He made them too, right? It's not just humans are the best and animals suck, right? Um, and I think I don't know, like a lot of people think it's like messed up that we used to use animal sacrificial system, right? But like it's not so far fetched, right? But like I said, like they were the ones that like don't have sin. They just have the effects of sin on them, right? Um the Bible reveals that like sin is like an inherited like state, passed on, genetically from like generation to the next, and that's why we have like this genealogy metaphor, right? But yeah, so like the sacrificial system was not like like God being bloodthirsty, like some of these sadistic like Canaanite gods that were around that like a lot of scholars rightfully say that like the tabernacle does mimic a lot of Canaanite altar worship, right? But um there's a reason for that because most of the time it's just like a mocking of the Canaanite worship and gods, right? Because the whole point was that like we're not like you for X, Y, and Z, right? Yeah, but like God wasn't like like sadistic or bloodthirsty like those, right? Like Molech was there for like child sacrifice, and Baal was just like he was the rain god, and like the only way to communicate with him was to like cut yourself and like summon him with like your blood. Yeah, but like it's not in God's nature to do like, unnecessary sacrifices, right? And it's definitely not in his nature to be cruel to something that he created and loved, right? So like if you look at like, just just cuz it's on my mind, just to prove that like God isn't really like these other gods. If you ever look at like Jeremiah 33 through 35, just to like summarize what it's saying is that like God pretty much says like you know, I did not ask for these like sacrifices, meaning like child sacrifices and like the other stuff, the 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 gross sexual stuff that was happening. God was like, "That's gross. I didn't ask for that. Like, I don't want that. It was never in my mind. Like, God's pretty much like saying like my mind is so pure, like I like that's not even like something I would fathom, like and he like thinks of like everything. So he's pretty much saying like that stuff's like outside of him, like that stuff like exists outside of him, which we know is sin, right? Because sin exists outside of God. Right. So God was like being a blood donor almost, kind of like a dialysis machine. So like the sin and guilt offerings was like kind of like a chemical. Oh, it was like a channel to pass impurities to God through animal sacrifices, right? So like I said, like the whole system of like the priests, they ate the animals, like that was also a way to pass on the impurities to the priests, right? So they ate the food, passed on the impurities to the priests, and they embodied that. And then they would atone for themselves and the people on the day of Yom Kippur, right? Um, and it was very like cyclic, right? So it was like it had a cycle to it. And of course, on the Day of Atonement, God was the one that took up the whole thing, and he was the one that transferred it to himself, and then like threw it the furthest away. However far God can throw away our iniquities from us, right? Yeah, also I should mention that like God doesn't like, believe in animal cruelty, right? So like when he gave the command or like the go ahead for Noah to start eating meat um at the ark, cuz remember he like saved all the unclean animals and the clean animals, which I should mention like the reason why we have clean and unclean animals is because like certain animals are affected more by the impact of sin than others, which is why we use the clean animals because they're less affected by the decay and corrosion of sin, right? And like their environments. Also, things that just associated with eating like waste or like eating dead things. You know, symbolically, that's just not a good thing. I mean, the animals are fine, but like I still wouldn't recommend eating them. But that's why we shouldn't be like discriminating animals for being clean or unclean, right? Which we know in like the New Testament, those are all done away with, right? Because of like Peter's vision, right? Because God was like, I made all of these. Because like if God didn't want to save the unclean animals, He wouldn't have put them on the ark, right? So I mean, like I guess you can eat your bacon. Right. I mean, I wouldn't, but that's a personal choice, right? Which, everyone has their own level of like consecration, right? Much like Noah, he was told like not to eat the blood of animals, mostly because that uh so like my mom my mom and I watched this show where like this guy has to, you know, live with this tribe and like they it's scarce out there. They live in the desert. So the only way to like eat, have nutrients is to just drink from the blood of animals, right? But that means that this animals like alive, also getting punctured like every other day. Even if it does clot fast, right? It still has some significance of suffering, right? And I mean, if you were pricked every day, like that sucks, right? Um, especially like when people are consuming you, right, in your blood. Um, so yeah, like God wasn't about like animal cruelty, right? Um, yeah. So like I said, there's an importance to blood, and that's because like it's something that's passed on genetically. And so we use the same system. Um, yeah. So anyways, I want to talk about the atonement, the tax money thing, because like I don't know, I felt like it was interesting to see how this was tied in with the New Testament, right? Because I always just kind of read over it and like it didn't make sense to me, but also just because